Now, there are many ways of training self-awareness and metacognition. There are many strategies that have been documented and many frameworks that have been used. And widely speaking, the more popular methods are actually fairly effective. So you could pick up a metacognition training strategy that you have found in a research article or in your best practice guidelines or something, and that will probably be good. I have experimented with many different types of strategies, and I found that one of the simplest and easiest and fastest, and especially easiest for the student to then take control of and use by themselves without needing you to constantly tell them to do it, is something that I call the cheat sheet. Here's what we do. Whenever someone has a particular problem with something, again, distractions, learning, whatever it is, let's use an example of being distracted very easily. We create a sheet. And on this sheet, we're going to note down all of the problems that this issue creates for us. So this step is helping to build self-awareness. It's starting to understand the effect that certain problems have, the impact that it has on us. This is important because some students don't understand the full extent of a problem. We all know those students where we look at them and think, this particular thing is really holding you back, but they don't understand, they don't see it. And so this can help to slowly get them to see those things. In this step, a teacher can help and facilitate the process by reviewing the list that they've created and asking questions that prompt them to think about other angles. Maybe they've only thought about the problems in one lesson. Maybe there are problems at home. Maybe there are problems when they're studying by themselves. Maybe there are problems in other subjects as well. And we can prompt them to think about these other dimensions that they may have skimmed over. It's very important in this situation not to be leading the student too much. We want to leave the questions quite open because we need them to introspect and think about this, because that is going to help build the skill of them identifying it themselves. So here's an example. Let's say that someone gets distracted on their phone all the time. And so the problem that we're starting with is getting distracted on my phone. And we list out the problems that it creates. And they might say, I miss what the teacher is saying in history class. For example, let's say that's all they've written. And we want them to understand that maybe this is stopping them from studying at home as well. Here is a good example of a probing question versus a not so good example. A good example would be, do you think that there are other areas outside of this class where it becomes an issue? Or even as simple as, is that all? A bad example would be a question like, don't you think that it's a problem while you're studying by yourself as well? You can see how that second question is a lot more leading. Now, we start with these bigger open questions that make them think about it themselves more. And if they really still struggle, we can progressively narrow these questions in until it gets to the one that's more specific so that they can see this answer. So it might start by saying, are there any other problems outside of this class? And they may think about it and think, I can't think of any. And you might say, well, what about when you're not studying in school? And they may think about it again and think they can't think of any. Then you may close in to say, what about when you're studying by yourself? And if they still don't think of any, you might say, do you get distracted with your phone when you're studying by yourself as well? And at that point, it's now just a yes or no question. So you can see we're starting with these open questions and then going progressively narrower and narrower. And so what this is doing is by asking these more open questions, it makes the learner think at a higher level. They're comparing and looking at all these different facets themselves. So that's a very important skill for the learner to develop. If they're not at the stage where they can do that type of thinking confidently, then instead of just torturing them by asking them this question again and again and again, we can break it down to find what level that they are at. And then over time, we can try to ask these more broad questions as they get used to thinking at these higher and higher levels. So once they've noted down their problems, we then want them to map out all the triggers for this distraction. When we say triggers, we're talking about the things that make the distraction event occur. So just having a phone doesn't mean you're going to get distracted by it. The trigger might be you hear a ding notification on your phone, or it vibrates, or something pops up on your phone and you see it. It could be as simple as the trigger was, I saw my phone on my desk, and then you felt the want to pick it up and start looking through it. Maybe that's not the trigger. Maybe the trigger is that you used your phone to look something up, maybe to help you study, but then you saw an icon for a game or some social media, and you decided that you want to click on that because you saw the icon, and that was the trigger. This is an incredibly important part that builds that metacognition, because we're now not just thinking about our actions, we're thinking about why we had those actions. So when we look at the science behind behavior and habits, we know that a lot of human behavior is not isolated. Human behavior is often a result of our environment and the triggers around us. A great example that I like to give is the idea of smoking. As a doctor, we're trained to help patients stop smoking all of the time. And we tell them to stop smoking. And when they're in hospital for a long time, we say, you really shouldn't smoke. We give them nicotine patches and all these other things. But when they go back home, they probably start smoking again. Why? Because all of their friends are smoking. Their entire social group is smoking. Their family is smoking. There's cigarettes all around the house. It's very difficult to change behavior when your environment is constantly triggering you to engage in that behavior. Likewise, it's very difficult for a student to focus if they're surrounded by an environment of distractions. And that environment could be physical or it could be digital. Okay, well, what about something like learning? Learning is not as obvious as just having a phone on your desk that you're getting distracted by. So this is a little bit different. To have proper self-awareness and metacognition around learning, we actually have to know what type of learning we want to be engaging in. And this is where it's useful to be familiar with and to teach your students about higher order and lower order thinking and higher order or lower order learning. Now, there are lots of different frameworks that you can use. The common ones are Bloom's revised taxonomy, Solo taxonomy. There's another one called the 4CID model. However, I think Bloom's taxonomy is the most useful because it comes at it from a learner's perspective and it talks about the type of thinking that they should be doing. Whereas Solo taxonomy, for those of you that are familiar with it, actually talks about the types of knowledge structures that would be created if someone did this type of thinking. And that's not very useful for a student. So there's a link in the description to this that goes through this in a little bit more detail. You can have a read through that. We'll create a resource for you to download as well that you can take away and use if you need to, or a handout that you can give to your students. But I'll give you the very basic summary of it now so that you have an awareness of what it looks like and how your students would use it. So with Bloom's revised taxonomy, it divides learning into these 6 different categorizations. From the bottom, it starts as memorization, then understanding, then applying, then analyzing, then evaluating, and then creating. So the idea is that apply, analyze, evaluate, and create are higher, but we really want to be focusing on above apply. So analyze, evaluate, and create. Create tends to be the very, very, very minority of learning. You're normally not doing create, which is to hypothesize on new information and knowledge based on what you know until you are doing postgraduate, especially PhD level. If you're a secondary teacher and you're working with secondary students, you pretty much never have to worry about that top level. None of your assessments will really be looking at that. Your students are never really expected to operate at that level. In fact, even you will probably never be expected to operate at that level unless you are the head of a department or a curriculum writer or doing some kind of extremely innovative new project. So the sweet spot is an analyze and evaluate. A simple way of teaching this, in my experience, and this is the way that I teach it, is that lower order learning is isolated and higher order learning is integrated. And this is the simplest way that I found that you can teach this to students. Isolated means each new piece of information we're learning, our focus is on simply trying to understand and remember that piece of information. And of course, it's important to understand new information. However, what's more important is to be able to use that information meaningfully. And that's where higher order learning comes in. Now, your brain does a very cool thing, which is that if you try to take new information, brand new, and you immediately try to do higher order learning on it, It will automatically do the lower order learning as part of the process. It's kind of like if you think about trying to reach a certain destination, and that destination is 100 meters away from you. If you aim to get to 50 meters, then you will get to 50 meters. But if you aim to get to 100 meters, well, you'll get to 50 meters also. It's just that you're gonna go further because you aimed further. So we don't need to tell students to just focus on understanding and remembering the information. That will happen automatically when they try to compare and contrast that information. So the characteristic feature of higher order learning is that we're integrating new information. We're integrating it with what we already know and the other new information. So how does this information fit? How is it similar and how is it different to what we already know? And how is it similar or different to the other parts of new information that we are learning, both in either this classroom or maybe something that we learned in the previous lesson or maybe a couple lessons ago. So when we do the self-awareness activity with the cheat sheet, we want to get users to start identifying what type of thinking they're doing. Do they tend to think isolated? Are you mostly spending your time reading or listening and just focusing on understanding and remembering each part in isolation? Or are we spending the time trying to compare, contrast, find similarities and differences, evaluate, and even create priorities of information between the different either prior or new information? It's often going to be a mix, and we want students to be aware of that mix. How does it feel when we do higher order thinking versus lower order thinking? It's probably going to be more difficult, and remember, that's a good thing. What is the effect that it has? Maybe it's more difficult, but I can remember it for longer. And that's the part that we celebrate. So we repeat this process. We build self-awareness first and understanding what type of thinking the person is doing. And then we start building that metacognition around, okay, when I do this, I feel this way, and this is the effect that it has. When I do it this way, it's more lower order and I feel more passive, or it's faster, but it's not as effective. And then I spend more time just relearning it because I forgot it. And then, so what can we do to try to do more of that higher order thinking? If you really struggle, what can I do to make the higher order thinking easier? Not make it easier by avoiding to do it, but doing it in a way that I feel is more manageable. And then we can increase our confidence and we get better and better and better at it. And so that would become the experiment. So now you see that this is a very different kind of thinking. We're now not only looking at something as simple as being distracted by your phone, but we're now starting to think about things that we may have never thought about before. Why is it that I'm not able to understand something? A lot of people think that it's because intelligence is fixed. You're only so smart. And yes, genetics has a role to play, but what I found is that for most people, they're actually far below their genetic potential anyway. And so the idea of genetically being more or less intelligent than someone isn't really a relevant thing to think about unless you're already at your genetic peak, which is extremely rare for me to see, to the point where actually in the tens of thousands of students I've worked with, I don't know if I've ever met anyone that is at that level anyway. So most of the time, that's not going to be a good reason. So now what this causes is us to reflect on our process of learning and the effect that we think it has. We then want to think about what we can potentially do to fix them, those adjustments that we might make. These are simply ideas. We don't know if it's going to work or not. Sometimes it will fix the problem straight away, but most of the time, especially for complicated problems, it's not going to work the first time. It's not going to work the third or fourth time. It will work on the 10th or 20th time. But every single time we try to adjust and reflect on it, we're getting more information about getting closer and closer to the solution. And this is the next fundamental requirement, apart from self-awareness and metacognition. It is the willingness to experiment.